I've reframed the word FAIL to first or further attempts in learning. First or further attempts in learning. So if you think about every failure or setback as a further attempt in learning, it shifts the way you think about it, right? Now it's a learning opportunity. You have more chances. You can grow. That shifts how you feel about it and ultimately how you respond.
Welcome to Iron Summit, where we cover topics about health, fitness, and general performance through the eyes of former elite Division I wrestlers.
All right. Awesome. We're live here. We got a special guest today, Dr. Taghizadeh. There we go. Got the pronunciation. I'm going to go through a quick bio here, but it's going to take a little while because you're a very accomplished dude. Super excited. He's a board certified adult, child, and adolescent psychiatrist.
Oh boy. Psychiatrist.
Psychiatrist. Thank you. MD from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. You maintain an independent practice in Baltimore. Faculty instructor at Johns Hopkins Hospital in the Division of Childhood, Adolescence, and Psychiatry. Medical doctor for Hidden Opponent, the top mental health nonprofit. I know Kobe Bryant has spoken about that as super helpful. He's been recognized as top doctor every year since 2016 by Baltimore Magazine. He's a 2023 TEDx speaker, and he's host of the Mindset Experience podcast. He works with elite coaches, athletes, military personnel, first responders, and businessmen to improve performance. And of course, and most importantly, former Division I wrestler. Dr. T, how's it going?
I appreciate you guys for having me.
No, this is awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Ryan got the pronunciation of your last name right, but he couldn't get psychiatry right.
Listen,
Pronounced my last name a lot better than he did my actual job with it.
yeah, I was just like, I'm getting these, your intro, and I'm like, it's just like a novel, man. You've done so many different things. You got me tripped up on the first one. But I think where we should start, honestly, is like, what got you into mindset training? Obviously, you got a crazy background. You're very educated. You've done a lot of different things. What made you pick this field, and why mindset training? Why are you so passionate about this? You even started a podcast on top of, the many things that you're doing.
Yeah, man. So, I mean, it really started with wrestling, right? Like, if you really want to go back to it, my passion growing up was to be a teacher and a coach, right? Like, as a wrestler, you get into the sport and you identify people that kind of mold you, shaped you, guide you. And, as a young athlete, but particularly a young wrestler, I think that a lot of times we take to these folks and we're like, man, I want to be like them. I want to be a coach, right? And I was fortunate enough to be able to wrestle to Division I like you guys, and really just continue to sort of think about how do I want to be involved in this sport. And so teaching and coaching was always the dream, was always the goal, right? My parents were the ones who discouraged it because they were like, listen, you're going to struggle financially. Like, they work really hard. They work a lot of hours. They don't make a lot of money. Like, you think your coaches has everything they want, but like, they're struggling financially. Right. But I didn't see that. I just saw that, they had what they needed. We were going to matches. We were going to tournament. They seemed happy, but it was still something I always wanted to do. So after I finished my college career, I became a teacher and a coach. I was a middle school teacher and a high school wrestling coach. And I loved it. I enjoyed it. But there was still a piece of me that thought, man, maybe I could go a little bit further, whatever that looks like. So that's when I applied to medical school during that year. What's really interesting, and I paint this picture for a reason, but when I had my medical school interview, man, like, it's an hour, right? You have multiple interviews. And I prepared like I did with everything else, man. I prepared diligently. I did practice questions. I did practice interviews. Man, I was on point, ready to go. And when I get there, the interview lasted 15 minutes. And the guy wanted to talk about wrestling. And that's it. And he had wrestled at UVA years ago. But, as he's bringing up all these concepts, like, man, you're a hard worker. And I was like, yeah. He's like, you're disciplined. I'm like, yeah. He's like, you got a lot of confidence. I'm like, yeah. He's like, but you're humble. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, why is he telling me things that I already know, right? And so he says all these things that you guys both know, right? And at the end of it, 15 minutes into it, he goes, I'm recommending you for entrance to medical school. And I was like, what? I'm like, man, I appreciate it, but I don't understand. And he said, look, man, everything you learned in that sport, Like, that's directly applicable to life. And he said, I'll never forget this. He said, the world needs more wrestlers. The field of medicine needs more wrestlers. That's why I'm recommending you to medical. So the reason I bring this up is then that shaped my entrance into med school. But then that thing about like, what is it about this sport? Right. And what is it about, what I learned through this sport that makes it so special. And so through med school, man, as hard as it was, I kept coming back to concepts that I had learned within my sport. Right. A lot of them were physical, but most of them were mental, right? And when I'm in these dark moments and studying for hours and all my friends are making money and they're going out and I have to make these sacrifices, right? I keep coming back to like, you've been here before, man. You've been here before. Like you've had to put other things aside for a greater purpose. So what are you going to do now, right? Balancing fitness, right? With my other schedule, right? Everybody's studying all these hours and I'm making it a priority to say, look, I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to challenge myself, right? Physically. That was an important piece. So I bring all that up to say that like the mindset was always integrated into what made me a successful med student, what made me a successful, I get to Hopkins for my residency, which in my field, right, which is psychiatry pronounced, by the way, Ryan. I get to my Hopkins is the number one program in the world. But these guys are working 80 to 100 hours a week, right? 80 to 100 hours a week, right? They're missing Thanksgiving. They're missing this. And people are struggling, man. They're crumbling. But I'm coming back to all the concepts that I kept learning. So the point of it is, man, that it was always integrated into what I was doing. And when I got out into the field, I loved building relationships. I had now had a medical degree. And I thought, man, how can I impact this space in a way that's different? Right. And that people are going to be drawn to me. And so ultimately, this idea of being a teacher and a coach never left me. And I just used my medical degree and my mental health background. And I decided that I was going to kind of rebrand and repackage mental health in a way that wasn't so reactive, right? And it wasn't like, man, if you got a problem and you're really struggling, you go see somebody like me. It was more about like what's preventative and proactive and what's going to ultimately get somebody like either of you to come see a psychiatrist, right? And it's going to have to be somebody that really attacks the mind in a more athletic way. And to me, that's where mindset comes in, right? It's not just about like how you feel, right? It's much more about how you think and how the way that you think can directly impact how you feel or what you do. So that's why I decided to come into it.
I love all that. I have so many questions off of that. First one, and I've wondered this myself. I actually just yesterday around like a local high school, like a elite youth and high school club. One of the dads came in. He's a former wrestler, very successful businessman. Was talking about all the lessons he learned from wrestling. He actually had the same quote: "We need more wrestlers in the business world." But what is it? And I have some theories of my own, but I'd love to hear yours. What is it about wrestling that that differentiates the athletes from that sport? Kind of teaches us the lessons. What do you think it is?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think there's a couple things, right? And there's probably a bunch of things, but the two things that stick out for me, one is problem solving, right? Like you can go in as prepared as you want, but you're actively having to solve problems and work through scenarios, right? And you have to sort of think, if I set this up and this is what happens, then I'm going to do this. But if this happens, I'm going to do this. And then you have to act very quickly, right? You have to react very quickly. So there are very few things that can replicate, right? I mean, you look at other team sports, like you set up plays, they evolve, they either work or they don't, and then you try again, right? But like this is a situation where when it doesn't work, if you don't react or adapt very, very quickly, you're going to end up on your butt or on your back. So to me, you can't necessarily learn how to do that unless you're actionably doing it. And for me, again, think about a middle schooler or high schooler. Like those are formative years when you're learning your independence, your individuation, like how to figure out stuff. And so like the sport lends itself to be able to be thrown in this situation where you're manipulating and figuring things out over and over and over again. And so within that, there's a confidence that comes out of that, right? And a determination, and an accountability. But I think the other thing that's also a big part of it, and Ryan and I talked about this before, it's man, there's this idea that man, if you work hard enough, right, you're going to succeed. And if you put in the work, you succeed. And this is a sport where that's not always true because you can work really, really hard and you can do everything you're supposed to do, but you may not get your hand raised, right? And how do you rebound from that? How do you come back and learn and say, look, I still grew from that. I still learned from that, right? And again, there are very, very few things in life that shape that. So those are two things that I think really allow somebody to grow. And those are foundational things that are important for success later in life, right? And so, right, it's not just medicine. Like business in the business world, right? Forbes magazine several years ago published an article about the top executives, man, they look for wrestlers, right? And again, it's this ability to problem solve, be accountable to yourself, be humble, but also sort of this confidence that there are very few challenges that I'm not going to learn from or grow from. Right. And I think the sport really, really lends itself to that. Um, it's also a very misunderstood sport. Right. And I think that there's something beautiful about that, that it really doesn't matter what other people think. It ultimately matters what you think and the people you surround yourself with. Right. And those are the people we train with and we're in the sauna with and we're rolling around with. Like, as weird as it looks to the outside world, man, like we have a certain level of trust in the people around us that are our smallest circle. And isn't that important for life, man? Because at the end of it, man, if you have a couple of people that you really, really trust and they trust you and you'll do anything for them, that's a really, really strong foundation to be able to be successful in life.
Yeah. That's interesting you say that too. I was actually talking about this with somebody today, but even just more broadly in sports in general, and then taking something to a professional level, um, outside of athletics. How do you think about like, I mean, I think sports, you kind of get constant feedback as to what's working, what's not working, constant like praise. Like if you're doing well in wrestling, you're getting your hand raised. Doesn't matter who you're wrestling, as long as you are the better wrestler, you win. And then you go to like play this game where maybe you're building a company or starting out your career, and it's like the huge delayed gratification of years and years and years of work where there's no real like milestones like you have in sports. And so I think about a lot like athletes, there's a lot of like mental health athletic communities, kind of like, I mean, just like what you work with the hidden opponent, but like I've seen other ones too that are like helping athletes transition into real world stuff. And I think athletes go off of feedback and are coachable, but they also are used to like having kind of a clearly defined set of rules in a game. And then you get to a different field where it's like, hey, you might be the best worker in your group, but it might be 5 years before you get promoted to the position you should be promoted in. So how do you think about that with a change from, I mean, you're going in athletics, what you put in is what you get out for the most part. Obviously, there's some variation. Wrestling, I'd argue you have a little bit more control over that with a one-on-one sport than like, football. But then you got to go do med school for 4 years. And then you got to go do residency. And then you got to go. So you're like delaying all these things. How did your mindset shift during that? And did you struggle with mental health kind of transitioning from a sport with constant feedback to this huge delayed gratification where you're climbing this mountain every day without really understanding or knowing what's going to be on the other side?
Yeah, man, it's a great question. I'm gonna say two things. One is you say that instant gratification, right? But think about when you transition to college, and you've talked about this as coach, how many people come into college and they don't get a takedown for like the first year?
It's true. Yeah, that's true.
They were used to getting their hand raised. They were used to like that consistent, like every time you have a dual meet, you're winning or you get a feedback, right? You either win or you learn, right? But then you get to college and you're like, man, what am I doing? I'm just getting my butt kicked and get my butt kicked and I get butt kicked. And like, why do I keep showing up? But you just keep showing up and you keep showing up, you keep showing up. And all of a sudden you realize it takes longer for you to get taken down. It takes a little bit longer. And all of a sudden now you end up in the scoring position. So that I think trains us that as long as you continue to show up and you focus on the process, you're going to continue to get better, right? And your success doesn't have to be defined by the outcome, right? That's another shift, I think, is so I think that's where college sports comes in, right? There are a lot of folks that come in and they haven't achieved the same level of success, for example, as you did, right? Myself included. And so you show up and you're grinding and you're grinding and you're grinding, but then you just go out and you're wrestling these guys that are just like incredible and you have to learn and you have to learn and you have to learn. So I think that part of it shapes you in a way that you're not aware of. The other part, man, is that the biggest struggle for me wasn't so much my mental health in the capacity that we're talking about. It was more about my identity, right? Because like that's what I was, man. I was a wrestler. Like I was a short guy who was stocky and my ears were all banged up, right? And I was always working. So like what happens, man? You go to residency and now you're in a shirt and a tie and a white coat that's dragging on the floor, right? Because I'm only 5'4". And like, how do you apply that? And so to me, there was a big, big piece of what people love to call imposter syndrome, right? There was a big piece of, man, I don't belong here. These people are really smart. These people are very well published. They're very well read. Like they had done a bunch of research and they had studied with like the top researchers and this, that, and the other thing. And then you go to a place like Hopkins, you got like Ben Carson walking in the hall, right? Who's like a world famous neurosurgeon. You have all these other big names who wrote like textbook and like buildings are named after, and they're literally just walking down the hall. And it's like, man, I don't belong here, right? Like, why am I here? And like, what if they find out I'm not smart enough? Like, how did I even end up here? These were the kind of thoughts that I had, right? And there was a shift. There was a part of me that I remember this moment where I was like, you know what, man? You've always done things kind of your way, and it got you here. Like, they picked you. Like, you wouldn't be here if you didn't belong. So, like, just go back to what you know, and it's either going to work or it's not. And so what did I do? I just went back to like working hard, being a great teammate, having a level of humility, um, using humor, right, as a way of like kind of just navigating the things that were really, really difficult, right? And I think about like when we're sucking weight and like it takes every bit of energy for us to talk, but like we'll crack some stupid joke and it gets us through like this other moment. And so like I just came back to that stuff, man. And so again, there was that the shift in mindset really for me was coming back to what I knew and what had worked for me. And I was like, let's see what happens. And it worked really, really well. I was named the chief resident, which is like, like the quote unquote captain, right? Um, I had a lot of accolades, and I was by far like when it comes to like level of intelligence and like, again, publications, all that other stuff, like, man, I was towards the bottom. But when it came to like recognition and relatability and where like who the patients and the nurses and all the support staff trusted in, I was towards the top. And I think that was a thing that, again, my shift was coming back to what I knew,
Mm.
right? And what had worked for me well.
That's so Ryan and I talk about this quite a bit actually. And Ryan, I think I'm gonna steal the term from you, reframing. You reframe your mindset and in relation to your identity and how you were gonna approach it during medical school, but it's something that it's easier said than done to reframe because you can tell yourself you're going to reframe something, but actually going and then changing your mindset and reframe. And we had a great conversation with Matt Brown, UFC legend, second most knockouts of all time, and I think he's excellent at reframing things. But that was, Matt is his opinion, which very valid one, comes from kind of the school of hard knocks. I'd love to hear what from a psychiatrist. How do you go about reframing? Like, what's the first steps? How do you actually make those initial thoughts stick? Like, how would you help someone go about reframing their mindset in a situation like you in medical school or, entering the next stage of your life, whatever it may be?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think reframing is huge, right? And, for the record, I don't think Ryan came up with it. I just think he used it.
Yeah.
Oh, but
Hey,
I'm giving Ryan too much
yeah, 'cause
credit.
I appreciate that credit.
Ryan can't.
No, but when Ryan and I talked, man, this was something him and I really kind of connected and clicked on, was he had used the word reframing, and it's something I do a lot, man. It's something I do a lot. I think it's so important. I think it's one of the most important skills within mindset and mindset training. And it's one of the most important things that are important for mental health, if you will, right? Because again, how we think about things directly influences how we feel and what we do and how we respond, right? And the whole field of psychology is based on that premise, right? That our thoughts directly influence our emotions and our behaviors or our actions. So that thought process is so important. What people don't realize necessarily is that we do have the ability to control how we think, right? We do have the ability and we have a choice in that. What people also don't know, and I don't know if you guys know this, but on average, the human brain has 60,000 thoughts that go through it on a given day, right? 60,000 thoughts come in and out of our head on a given day, right?
Ryan's like half of that, but
I'm more efficient.
More than he's probably got a few more, but like 80% of them are negative or irrational, meaning they don't make sense. They're not consistent with the way we want it. And then 90% of them are repeats, right? So the idea is, if you leave it up to chance, chances are you're going to have 80% of your 60,000 thoughts are going to be negative and 90% of them are going to be repeats. And the more we hear something, the more we believe it. The reason that's important to understand is because if we reframe, then we're actively shifting that narrative. We're actively shifting that thought process, right? And the more we do it, the more we're going to start to believe those thoughts, right? So, and it's not just about being positive and being like, I'm amazing, I'm strong, I'm capable. Like, those are sort of these statements that people think of that, in my opinion, really get diluted, right? And they're often used very ineffectively. But the ability to problem solve, right? And this is where reframing comes in, is like you're taking a thought and then you're problem solving, saying, how do I manipulate this, right? How do I move this around? And how do I shift that? And so your brain has to learn. It's an active learning process. It's not just saying something passively, right? It's an active learning process of taking a word problem, if you will, right? Translating into something that's more consistent and works for you, and then being able to actually train that. So it takes practice, man. I mean, it really, really does take practice. In my opinion, it's probably one of the hardest skills for us to learn, but it's the most effective. So, man, like, how do I do it? Right? Like, to answer your question, I legitimately look for opportunities to reframe things, right? So Ryan and I talked about this, man, and I've kind of become somewhat famous for this. And to be fully, fully transparent, I didn't come up with this. I just use it a lot. But I've taken that word fail that everybody's so afraid of, right? Everybody's so terrified of the word fail, right? And I've reframed the word FAIL to first or further attempts in learning. First or further attempts in learning. So if you think about every failure or setback as a further attempt in learning, it shifts the way you think about it, right? Now it's a learning opportunity. You have more chances. You can grow. That shifts how you feel about it and ultimately how you respond. So I do that actively, but practically speaking, right? Um, when I have a setback or I have a negative thought, I sort of look at it and say, all right, man, this is what you're thinking. How can you change this? How can you think about this differently? And if I can't think of anything, ultimately I think, man, how can you learn from it? How can you learn and grow from this? And when you do it in that context over and over and over again, your entire experience changes. But like, Max, I do this at football games, man. We're diehard Ravens fans, right? There's a big play, Ravens fumble, 75,000 people are completely having a miserable experience now. They're yelling and they're screaming and they're cursing and they're doing all this. Man, I'm on the edge of my seat. I'm like, let's see what happens next. And my wife's like, what? I'm like, man, this is a great opportunity for the defense to have to respond and see what they're going to do inside the 5-yard line. She's like, did you just see what happened? I'm like, yeah, but if we're going to win the Super Bowl, man, the defense has to know that you can do everything right. And then you still got to come back and you still got to work it out, right? So let's see what they do. Dude, I'm on the edge of my feet enjoying my experience way more than the 75,000 other people, right? Who are completely miserable. But it's because, like, I'm actively choosing to utilize that in that moment. But if you can do it in a football game, right? Or you can do it at work, or you can do it in a relationship, now it's something that just like naturally starts to come, and it becomes like a fun little game in some ways, because you're like, let me figure this out. Let me figure that out. And again, your brain gets
Right.
excited, it's learning, and it's like, dude, let's go. Right.
And
If you
go ahead, Ryan.
that way.
Yeah, I think this brings up an interesting point too, where like, I think reframing is super important, and the way you talk about it makes a lot of sense. But then I also think there's a certain component of like being honest with yourself about some stuff too. Sometimes relieves the pressure of it. If you're like you see people do it a lot when they get up to speak. They're like, "Hey, I'm really nervous." Then once they like tell everybody that they're nervous, and it's like I got that out in the open, it like actually calms you down a little bit. And so there's a certain sense of like honesty with it and being true to yourself in the same sense. But I want to know what you think about. I've worked with some coaches that think like the more you talk about like performance anxiety in a sport, the more they're focusing on it and the more it can like actually make it spiral downwards, which I kind of understand that view, but I kind of disagree with that a little bit because I'm like, if you never actually fix the issue, just pretending like it's not there doesn't help anything either. So how do you think about like, I mean, there is definitely, I think some people that overly like focus on this because people keep telling them like, hey, you don't do well in big moments. You don't. And so like they tell themselves that story. How do you reframe that for somebody and make sure like if you're a coach or if you're, you know, teaching your kid to do something to not focus on that and make the act of talking about it, make them more anxious about it and actually make the problem worse, but actually fix the root issue.
Yeah, man. So, I do think it's a good point. The more we hear something, right, the more we believe it. So if we're constantly telling ourselves, I'm nervous, I'm nervous, I'm nervous, I'm nervous, you're going to start to believe I'm nervous, I'm nervous, I'm nervous. So in that sense, I get that. At the same time, if you're completely ignoring the way that you're feeling or thinking, and you're like, no, man, I got this, I got this, I got this, but you really don't, then that also invalidates it because you're like, I keep telling myself I got this, but I don't feel like I have it. So like,
Right.
again, that honesty that you talk about,
Yeah.
you actually feel disingenuous and you're like, dude, I'm a total fraud because I keep saying I'm confident, but I don't. So there's sort of this three-step, you know, kind of model that I've come up with, right? And one is the first part of it is acknowledge, right? So when you have a thought, man, acknowledge it. Like acknowledge, man, I'm nervous, right? Or I'm scared or whatever, right? And accept the feelings that come with it. So you acknowledge the thought, you accept the feelings, right? And that way you're not fighting because that takes a lot of energy, right? To fight all feelings. But then you create a plan of action. And the problem is that a lot of times we have all this awareness, man. Like we can acknowledge, but we don't accept it or go to action, right? So we just say like, man, I'm sad or I'm anxious or I'm depressed. And this is part of the problem in mental health to be, in my opinion, is that we talk so much about awareness, awareness, awareness. Now there's a lot of awareness. So people are talking about it and they're feeling it. And in some ways they're supporting each other, which is great. But then there's no like education and action, right? Like you have to have a plan of, okay, I'm nervous, but this is what I'm going to do, right? Or I'm anxious, but this is what I'm going to do. And so when you can sort of acknowledge the way you're thinking and that kind of you're validating, right? That these are the thoughts that are going on in my head and I'm validating that those are my, the thoughts that are in my head, right? And I'm hesitating to say my thoughts because a lot of times we don't choose these thoughts. Like we don't choose to want to be nervous or scared, right? These are just the thoughts that pop up. But we're validating it, man, and we're acknowledging it. But then we also accept that, like, man, I feel this way. I'm terrified, right? Or I'm, overwhelmed, or I'm anxious, or I'm sad, or I'm frustrated, I'm discouraged, whatever it is, man. Acknowledge the feeling because that's the way you feel. But then once you do that, then say, all right, man, what am I going to do? And that's where the reframing also comes in. It's like, okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this, right? Or I'm just going to go out and work on my thing. Or I know that I have a great, low single, so I'm going to work on it, right? When I'm working with athletes, man, right? Um, and Max has a Lehigh shirt on you, and I've talked about this, man, but I work with Darian Cruz, right? And as Darian's getting ready for everything, man, a lot of what I talk about is, brother, what are the three things you're confident in? Like, you can do better than anybody else, right? And he brings them up. And so we talk about, all right, man, so you're thinking this, you're feeling this, but what you're focused on in those three things, if you do those three things really, really well, it's going to be really hard to beat you, right? So no matter what, we get into these situations and he's thinking, man, this is a big match. But he's been at a bunch of big matches, right? Man, I got to wrestle the American. I'm like, bro, you're a national champ. You've wrestled lots of Americans, right? You've beaten them all, right? So what do we focus on, right? What do you know you're good at? And that's the idea of reframing and shifting, again, that perspective and that thought process to talk about what you're good at, what you know you're going to do well. And if you start thinking about what you can do well, man, your confidence is going to go up because you're like, I know I'm good at this. So I'm just going to focus on this, right? It's like investing, right? Investing in a business that you know is going to generate revenue. The more you put into it, the more you get out of it. And the more you get confident, like, man, this is working, this is working. So then that allows you, then when you have those other thoughts or those feelings, you don't sweat them as much. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Ryan, you asked a different question, but the answer was the question I was going to ask next, which is, and I think you just addressed exactly how to do it, but a lot of people, it's really hard to change that. You talked about that, 80%, was it 80% negative?
80%
Yeah.
negative. Oh, yeah.
It's hard to change that. And people get really stuck in that. And I was going to ask, like, how do you start to practice changing that behavior? But you just hit it right on the head. So it's kind of acknowledge what the issue is or what your feeling is at that point in time, come up with a plan of action, and then just start stacking wins and belief that you can reframe this, or you can, it's not like you're going to magically overcome adversity, but you start to believe that you can, and that being nervous is okay. Being scared in this situation is okay. You're gonna get through it.
Yeah, no, and a lot of people talk about, man, like, you gotta be positive, you gotta be positive. It's really hard to be positive, man. Like, if 80% of your thoughts are negative or rational and 90% of them are repeat, it's really hard. So, rather than focusing so much on, "I gotta be positive, I gotta be positive, I gotta be positive," when you can, like, acknowledge, accept, and then create a plan of action, it takes a lot of pressure off, man, because it's not about necessarily being positive. it's really more about like, man, how do we shift into like more of like neutral thinking and just sort of accept the way we feel and then what can we do about it? And then in that comes the positivity, right? Because then it's more authentic. Like you said, Ryan, it's not like you're just being honest with yourself about how you're thinking and how you're feeling. And it's a more authentic way. And there doesn't have to be emotion with everything. And so like when you get to that neutral point, man, now it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do? What can I do? All right, I'm just going to go out and wrestle, right? Or I'm just going to go out and focus on this. That alleviates a lot of pressure, man, because if you have to be positive and you have to go out and wrestle, but you got this whole negativity thing, man, like it's a lot to take on, right? And in a lot of ways, I mean, you guys can agree or disagree, but I think in this sport, I mean, the majority of the time you're wrestling that thought process in your head, right? That's really what you're wrestling, right? And if
Yeah.
you can navigate that and get through that, man, like you get on the mat, that part's the easy part, right?
Yes. Yeah. I like that a lot too. I think something I definitely heard my dad say a lot growing up, but just like respond, don't react. And it's like knee-jerk reactions are usually the worst thing you can do. You know, somebody says something hurtful to you and you just like say something back without thinking about it, or just like any kind of high emotional state, it's not a great idea to make a big decision. And that's tough in sports. I think it teaches you a lot to calm your mind because like you don't have 3 days to think about what move to do next. You have like 0.3 seconds to figure it out. um, but some of what you were just saying too, I think it makes a lot of sense, but I also think it's not just a like, hey, you can reframe this. It's like, by the way, you have to back it up with a bunch of work behind it where you have the confidence that you can actually do these things. Like if I'm telling Darian Cruz, like focus on your three best things, you got to actually practice wrestling and have your three best things. Right. And so I think what you're saying and what I've heard a lot and what I think about too is like, how do you make society be more resilient? And it seems like put your kids, like help provide opportunities for kids to be in really tough situations a lot so that their toolbox is very expanded and able to like like respond and be resilient through challenges. Cause once you're like, hey, I made it through cutting 10 pounds. I wrestled this guy and this guy, even though my ACL was torn and I figured this out. Then you have the confidence when you get in that moment where you're like, I've never gotten up in front of 10,000 people. I got to make this speech about something, but I know how to prepare. I know that I've done things before when the odds were against me. And so I think that kind of leads into my next question. Like, how would you train somebody? Like if you got to mold a kid from, let's say your kid, right? From when they're a baby to when they're older, how do you make somebody as resilient as possible, knowing what you know?
Brother, so I'm funny you're laying. If you could mold a kid, I got a 3-year-old son and I got a 6-month-old son.
There you go.
Um,
Oh, they're molded kids.
All right. What's your game plan for your kid?
man, brother, it is. I'll tell you my game plan and I'll tell you what I did right before this call, which you guys will love. Dude, my game plan is one is, it's how do you make somebody resilient? I don't think you can make somebody resilient. I think you can shape somebody to be able to be resilient, right? And I do think that inherently kids are pretty resilient, right? You see they fall, they get back up. A lot of times they look at your reaction. So part of it is giving them that space to be able to figure things out on their own, right? And that's where it comes, I think, from a parenting decision is making sure that you and your significant other, or you and your co-parent, whatever that looks like, are really kind of understanding that, look, there are going to be some challenges and we want to make sure that our kid does not get hurt, but we also want to make sure that they grow and they develop, right? And so that's probably the biggest struggle is making sure that my wife and I are on the same page because we think differently, right? Like, admittedly, like I have a wrestler's mentality, right? And I have a lot of sort of knowledge and background of childhood development, but I'm also not a mom, right? And I don't have that emotional like connection, right? Like I'm pretty empathetic, man. But that's a whole nother level, man. So part of it is really understanding and validating where we come in with, make sure we're having those conversations, man. So to get to the kid, man, it's part of it to me is really understanding and educating myself about their development, where they are. It's trying not to show strong reactions, right? Either way, right? When they do something, and really the other thing is, man, what I really try to focus on is the effort. Like, and I've said this, man, because I've gone to enough parties and have friends that have play enough sports that when they're like, oh, so-and-so scored 5 goals, man, tell Dr. T, that you scored 5 goals. Isn't that amazing? And I'm like, you know what? And I look at the kid and I'm like, man, you must have worked really hard for that. You must have really hustled and been in the right position, right? And really found opportunities. So I remember telling my wife, I said, man, I never want to be the dad that talks about like how many goals my kid scored, how many times he won a match. what his grades were. I want to focus on the effort, right? So what I drill with my kid every morning before he goes to school, my 3-year-old, I say, Zane, what are our 3 things that we're going to focus on today? Right? And the 3 things we always focus on, I say, be kind, work hard, and have fun. Be kind, work hard, and have fun, right? And I say it every morning, and then he says it, right? And then he goes to school. And so to me, and how are you kind to kids that aren't nice to you, right? They take your toy, they don't want to share, but you got to be kind. That's being resilient, right? Like that's adapting, right? Working hard, like knowing that not everything is going to be easy, right? And then I think having fun is probably the most important, but it's the most important because as life gets further and further, it's hard, man. Like, how do you continue to have fun when you're just like grinding and grinding and grinding and grinding and it's not always working out? But if that's sort of your mentality and your mindset, then that really allows you to go through. And those are 3 things that you can always control, right? So that's what I'm doing is through talking to him and through teaching him, I'm really trying to teach those concepts in a way that's really fun. I also try really hard, and I'm getting better and better at it, is not raising my voice. So when I want to elicit a response, I try to lower my voice, right? I try to lower my voice to kind of a whisper. I'm like, hey, buddy, come here. And the reason I think that's so important is because then he's going to be more likely to listen and he's not going to shut down, right? When people get anxious and overwhelmed, their language center shuts down. They can't listen or process, right? So when we yell, think about it as a coach, man, when you yell at those kids, sometimes they don't hear a thing you say, but when you bring them over, you're like, hey, man, what happened? Talk to me, right? And so part of it is allowing him to be receptive and listen to me, because then if he's listening to me and we're working together, his brain is going to start to become more resilient because we're working together, right? I'm not telling him what to do because I said so. And he's not doing it out of fear, because fear does not build resilience. It builds results in the short term, but it definitely doesn't build resilience, right? And so that's another thing that I do. And the other thing, man, you should talk about putting him in different situations. So we wrestle, man. Like he always comes to me, he's like, Daddy, can we wrestle? And I'll get right in my face. So what do? I put him on his back. And I said, what do you turn to your belly and face? So tonight, I put him on his back. I go, what do you do? He goes, turn to my belly and face, right? And my mother-in-law is like, what are you teaching him? I go, a wrestler's never on his back. She's like, oh boy. I'm like, but it also teaches him that when you fall, like whenever you fall, you want to turn to your belly, right? Like you want to turn to your belly and brace yourself, right? Because otherwise you hit your head. And she was like, oh, teaching him even how to manipulate his body, but in a fun way. I'm also teaching him not to end up on his back, right? So it's like those ways of making it playful and fun and communicating in a way that like we're developing our language, but it's like doing it together, right? And yelling is not a part of it, but me participating in his growth and development builds that relationship and that bond where I'm hoping he starts to figure out these things and he's doing them because like we're doing them together, right? And to me, there's a resilience that comes with that, but also I really hope this is a willingness and an openness to say, look, man, I'm struggling. I can come to daddy because I know daddy loves me no matter what. I know daddy will have my back. And that's an important part of resilience that we don't think about, man. It's not just like picking yourself up and figuring out. It's also knowing, man, like, how do I go to my teammates? How do I go to my coaches? How do I go to the adults in my life and say, man, I'm struggling. I need help, right? Even as a wrestler, right? Like, how do you get better, man? You practice partners, right? Teammates, coaches, like you have to be willing to ask questions and to solicit support, right? And that's what makes you a champion. So what I'm trying to do is really develop this collaborative relationship with this kid where he knows that unconditionally I love him, but the language we're using, right, is a mindset component. The way we're playing, right, has to do with problem solving. And I let him figure stuff out a lot of times. I also let him talk about his emotions. He says, I'm sad. I said, tell me why you're sad, bud. I'm sad because blah, 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 blah. Okay. I would be sad too when that happened to me, right? What makes you happy, right? So like we're even developing this language about emotions where it's not like this fragile thing that you don't want to talk about it. It's allowing him to become more resilient, that he can say I'm sad and it doesn't mean that he's weak, right? He can say that he's frustrated. It doesn't mean that, he's a baby, right? Like it just means he's frustrated or he's sad. So what are we doing, man? We're acknowledging it, we're accepting it, and then we create a plan and be like, okay, what makes you happy? What can you do?
That's awesome. I mean, I think so many things there, especially just parenting in general is like that's the ultimate challenge. So, and it's really cool to be able to, I'm sure from your perspective, employ some of what you've learned and practiced using on athletes over the years on your own kids. That'd be pretty awesome, rewarding experience. Another thing kind of on the same vein is, a lot of parents are trying to do the right thing by their kids. And it's something Ryan and I talk about a bit, which is there's a connection between the mind, the body, and the spirit. And I think Ryan, you were getting at this a little bit, like with putting your kids in difficult situations, which is, I think, like one of the best areas to do difficult things in today's world is fit, because you learn a lot about yourself by doing difficult things physically. We don't live 100 years ago, 500 years ago, where you had to worry about a whole lot of other things that we don't have to worry about today. So how do you look at, especially for kids, but just people in general, the link between mind, body, and spirit, and then the importance of, doing difficult things physically, how that helps build the mind and the spirit?
Yeah, man. I mean, so you're right. Like they're all connected, right? And when you're doing things physically, you're also doing things mentally, right? Like every physical challenge, you have to think about it. You have to like, there's a point where you want to give up, you want to quit. You have to figure out how do you work through that? How do you navigate that? So those things are really connected. And I think that that's an important piece of it. But then that kind of, that spirituality part, comes through too, because then you really sort of have to decide, like, why am I doing this? Right. Like, what's my purpose in this? Like, what am I believing this? Like, what do I believe will happen? Right. And so I think that those physical challenges for kids, particularly, it's an easy way because there's more opportunities, right? Cognitively, right? Intellectually, no, kids don't develop the ability to really problem solve mentally until later on in life, but physically they can do it. So it's also like a great teaching tool because it's more integral with the way things work, right? Like if you're trying to talk to a 6-year-old about their behavior and about their consequences and, take away their iPad for a week, like they don't understand that. Like you just rock their whole world. You know what I mean? Like, but if you're navigating these things in a difficult way or you're navigating these physically, like they can figure that out, right? Because their whole life, man, early development, like you're trying to walk, you're trying to crawl, you're falling, like that's all physical challenges. That's all physical challenge. You're trying to stand, you fall down. You try to stand, you try like that's all you're hanging on things, you let go. Like that's all physical challenges. So I think just that's how we inevitably are learned growing up and it's fun, right? So if we can kind of continue that and we can allow our kids to be a part of that, I think there's a big, big learning component to that. But I also think to your point, it's making it part of the active learning process. So I think we have as adults, we need to do a better job being physical with our kids, right? And that doesn't mean throwing them around, but it means like actively being like, if I want my kid to like work hard, I got to work hard. I got to show them. I can't say, man, I was a college wrestler. I know what it's like to work hard. And I'm sitting on my butt, man. So part of the reason that I compete and train, I mean, I train in and I do a lot of different endurance events and different challenges in large part because I would, was a Division I athlete and I never want to stop being a Division I athlete. But there's another part of it where it's as a physician, right? When I'm working with athletes and other people that have challenges, I'm saying, look, man, I got you. I need to show them. But the most important thing, and it's evolved over time, is as a dad, man, if I'm telling my kid, I know it's hard, but you can endure it. I know you can do it. Like when my kid sees me exercising, right, he wants to exercise. When I'm doing bear crawls, he hops on my back and we do bear crawls, right? He tells people, my daddy exercises. My daddy takes me to the gym. I took the kid to the gym once and I'm over here stretching. I turn over, he's stretching, right? I'm doing push-ups. He jumps on my back. It's a fun part of the connection. And so what happens, man? Mind, body, and spirit is all getting connected in that moment because we're sharing a moment that's really integral to the spiritual foundation of our family. We're talking through it. We're having conversations about, man, this is so hard, man, blah, 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 blah. Isn't this awesome? It's so fun. But we're doing something physically together. And that becomes like a part of the culture, it becomes part of the communication. So like Ryan and I talked about this before about how these young coaches, man, like are getting into the room and they're working out with kids. And kids meaning college athletes, right? That's huge because that's exactly what you're doing, man. You're doing mind, body, and spirit. Because you talk about the purpose, why we're here, what we're doing. It's not just about building a championship, but you're like connecting with something, right? And that's a really, really important part of spirituality, right? And there's a connection to something. And it could be, man, these coaches and this room and this family, like this is my sanctuary. But also what's happening, man, you're training your body and you're training your mind all in one. And it becomes this really, really cool place where you can come in there and it becomes like your physical activity, your mental activity, your spiritual activity. And that's why sport can be so important, particularly at the collegiate level, because it really does provide so much opportunity to tap into those three things, but all in one. You don't have to go to a separate place to do this, a separate place to do that. It's all part of the experience, right? And so it's training it as one. It's not just saying it's one, it's actually training it as one.
Yeah. No, I love that a lot. And I think, like you're saying, leading by example, especially with kids, like they'll hear you once or twice, but like watching what you do every day is such a, that's imprinted on their brains. And kids want to emulate their parents. You know, they're superheroes growing up. So I think that's really cool. I got two questions. Might be related, might not. I don't know. But off of that, like, what do you think the link is here with nutrition and mental health stuff? And then also, what are your thoughts on mental health and how prevalent it has been in the last, couple years, maybe in 10 years? It seems like from my perspective, and I don't know if you disagree with this, Max, but like it's gotten a lot more prevalent. I don't know if that's like people are talking about it more, or like I've noticed just in the short time I've been coaching, like it seems like a lot more people are actually struggling with that. And so I want to know your thoughts on what a core driver is with that. Maybe that's related to some nutrition stuff. Maybe it's not, but yeah, those two questions.
Yeah, man. So I think nutrition is huge, right? Like I think what we expose ourselves to makes a big difference on how we think, how we feel, and what we do, right? So nutrition, sleep, um, what we consume, right? In terms of media, anything, right? Relationships. I mean, all of those things are important. So I lump them together, not to say that they're all one and the same, but to say that like a lot of times we piece these things out and we're like, man, but I'm doing this, I'm doing this. No, man, it's like, think about it as sort of like this holistic view that, man, if I want to be a better person, I want to be a better version of myself, I have to eat better. I need to sleep better. I need to hydrate myself better. I need to figure out what I put in my body, what I put in my mind, right? And what I kind of put in my environment. So I think that's a huge, huge thing. Um, I know personally when I'm eating a certain way or I'm consuming certain things better, like my energy is better, my mood is better, like all of those things, right? So I think it's huge. I think it's huge. And I think that college athletics is doing a much better job of recognizing that as a piece of it, right? So I think that's important. To answer your next question, man, I think it's a multi-layered thing. So rather than get too much in it, I think that number one, people are talking about it more. So there's more of an awareness. There's more exposure to hearing people talk about it, right? Through social media and through other things. People are more sort of accepting about it, right? So they're acknowledging it and they're accepting it, right? To go back to those two terms. But I also think that things are more complicated now. Um, and there is a higher level of pressure. And not that there wasn't before, but like I just think there are more things to keep track of. There's more stimulation coming in. There's more expectations coming out. And so I think that overall, like our brains have not developed any more than they did 500 years ago. But like the amount of data and input that we have to process has significantly increased, right? So it's like this, man. It's like physically, if your strength training regimen, right, or your strength and conditioning regimen is the same that it was in high school, but now all of a sudden you're wrestling NCAA champ, All American, NCAA champ, and you have a tournament every weekend. Like, if you haven't changed your training, man, what's going to happen? Your muscles are going to pull, they're going to tear, and they're not going to be able to keep up, right? They're not. You'll have to change the way you train. And so what's happening, I think, is mentally, we have not evolved in that capacity, but like the amount of like things that we have to deal with on a regular basis is so much more, so much faster. There's just a lot more. So I think what's happening, man, our brains are getting stretched. And so if you have a vulnerability, like if you have a predisposition to anxiety, depression, ADHD, now it's going to get highlighted more, right? But even if you don't have a vulnerability, man, like again, you can now start to experience some of those things because life is just much more complicated. And we haven't necessarily, like we think we have, but I don't think we've necessarily evolved in terms of being more proactive about it. We're much more reactive, right? To your point, right? Like, oh, if you have a problem, it's now okay to go talk to somebody. That's great. But like, how many college student athletes want to acknowledge they have a problem?
Yeah, no,
Right.
I have a on the back of that. What do you think? So I'm super interested in this topic, and definitely not an expert myself, but done reading and listening. And what do you think the drivers, the primary drivers between that? You said stretching our brains, the influx of data, the obvious one that stands out to me is social media and just how much pressure that is, especially on kids. I'd be interested to get your take on that and how social media. I know there's pretty shocking statistics on like suicide rates, especially for teenage girls since Instagram came out, TikTok, but also teenage boys, younger boys. So social media is like a big obvious one. What else do you think is driving that kind of pressure that we haven't evolved to deal with yet?
Yeah, man. So I think that one big part of it is social media and just technology in general, because it's faster now. It's faster. It's like you're not problem solving. You're just clicking and you get an answer. You're clicking, right? So it's just like input, input, input. Social media, obviously, that highlights the social construct of like what other people look like, what they're doing. I think two other things that play into it. One is that while kids have evolved, quote unquote, and they're more aware of it and they want to talk about it more, I don't think that adults have evolved at that rate. And so they want to talk about it, but people don't want to listen, or people don't have time for it. Or look, man, we can't focus on that. We got to focus on the next game. We got to focus on this. And so like that ability to stop and really invest in the relationships, I think overall is still has not evolved. I think there are some coaches, right, that do a really, really good job and they really invest in the athlete and they care about the athlete as a person and they invest in the person, I should say. And so that's huge. But like they still feel ill equipped to have some of these conversations. So they get uncomfortable, they get squirmy, right? Somebody brings something up. So now all of a sudden it's like, man, if I bring something up uncomfortable and my coach gives me a look, and I'm like, dude, did I just upset my coach? Right? Like maybe I shouldn't talk about this. So now we internalize it more. So I think there needs to be just overall a better ability to do that. And then the other thing, man, is like substances. Like I hate to say it, man, but substances have evolved, right? Like how many college athletes do you see? Like it's not just about drinking anymore, man. Like it's a lot of other things that again impact, right? We talked about nutrition. Like those are other things that we're putting in our body that are also directly impacting our mind. And so like while we think that they're alleviating our anxiety and improving our mood in the short term, they might be, but our brain's taking a hit every time. And so now again, our baseline level of anxiety goes higher. Our predisposition to depression goes higher. Like our motivation, attention, focus gets lower, right? So like there's a lot of, I think there's a technology piece, there's an environmental piece, there's behaviors that we're doing and engaging in right now that are not necessarily helping. And so we're not as resilient, right? Because we're going to something that works immediately. And so yeah, we can sleep tonight, but now we can't sleep for the next month and a half unless we have that, right? And now what does that say? So I think it's a lot of things, but those are three big things that I would say that are just really, really important.
So piggybacking off of that, you're a parent, you're gonna like have to deal with giving your kids technology, giving them, I've heard just generally like a lot of parents like, hey, it's really easy to your kid behaves really well when you hand them an iPad and they'll lock in there, but also it's maybe the easy short term thing, but then long term it's maybe not the best thing always. Um, how do you think about this stuff? When are you going to give your kid, a cell phone? When are you going to allow your kid to be on social media, knowing what you know, and also not trying to alienate your kid from, the social pressures of being really different from all these other kids too? Or how do you think about that?
Yeah, man. So, I mean, the short answer is I don't know. Because by the time my kid gets to that level, I don't know what social media will be like or technology will be like. One thing I will say though is I'm not going to give my kid anything. My kid's going to earn it, right? There's a big difference, right? Because we give our kids things because we think that it makes them happy. And in the short term, right, it makes it easier for us. But now they haven't learned about the ability to sort of like that our actions have consequences, right? Or, there are responsibilities that come with things, that these are privileges, right? And so when we understand that something is a privilege or responsibility, we have a different take on it, right? And so this idea of giving somebody something and then taking it away, right? Like, of course they're going to get upset if you take something away that belongs to them, right? If somebody comes into your house and takes your TV off your wall and walks out, you're not going to get pissed, right? They took something, it's yours. So like this, part of it is, again, we come back to reframing it. The language, right? You're not giving your kid anything. They're earning it through what? Through hard work, right? Through their effort in school, through their, relationships, through showing that they're responsible and have healthy relationships. So they earn it. And then what happens? They earn the ability to sort of accumulate apps, right? But again, it's through responsibility, through conversations, through showing them. So, man, I say that all now with a 3-year-old, right? When my kid is 12 or 13, and it's going to be a lot harder. But I think this idea and this mindset of how do we set these kids up to be able to have that independence and autonomy that they've earned these things also then shapes the way they approach them, right? I mean, you guys think about everything that you've earned in life, particularly even through your sport. Don't take it for granted. You know what I mean?
Well, that's
Cheap.
why it's special. That's why you appreciate it, is because you worked for it.
And you
I
don't take
think that's a huge, and you were hitting on it, and I think it's a major issue with, and the technology exacerbates this, is instant gratification. But no one, or I don't want to say no one, that would over, but an issue is a lot of people are looking for the easy instant fix to everything, when all that's doing is that making them more ill. Whether it's technology, whether it's, not problem solving, it's going to AI to ask it a question rather than figuring it out yourself. And it's not that those things aren't valuable tools and shouldn't be used sometimes, but if you just do it for everything and every aspect of life, you're going to end up, you know, questioning what is the purpose of life. I think, and maybe this is an oversimplification in my way of handling it in my simple brain, is you just got to do the work, and the work itself is the win. That's what makes you feel good. That's what makes you happy. That's what gives you fulfillment. The work is the win, not the end result, not the answer at the end of the AI, or the likes on social media. It's the effort.
But going off of that, Max, too, is like, I don't know what the right answer is, but like, I definitely think like there's a lot of value in, like, I've thought about it personally, like just deleting all these apps off my phone. Cause it's like, no matter how much you are aware of it and how much, like, there's a bunch of studies that come out and everybody recognizes, like, you can see your screen time on your iPhone. It's engineered to trap you. And I'm like at the point where I think it's definitely more negative than it is positive. And I don't think like, I don't spend a crazy amount of time on my phone, but the amount of hours I could save in a week, month, and year doing more productive things than being on an Instagram, a Twitter, scrolling through emails. Like, I think it's like, I'm almost to that point where I think it's like, it's almost worth going and getting a flip phone. And so it's like, how do we value that? How do we do that and be able to be up with the times and technology without continuing down
We're
bad path?
Yeah, we're both trying to grow a podcast. Yourself, Ryan, and I. Like, how do you do that without engaging with social media? That's the
That
world we live in. Brutal.
I'll say this, man. Well, if you get a flip phone and you walk on a Stanford's campus, no kidding. Do that at Northwestern, you cannot do that. This is what I do, man. It's interesting you guys bring this up. I think there's also it's about being intentional, man. It's not all or nothing, because again, there's a reality of how we engage with our environment. Like, it's a lot easier to respond to emails from your phone or even engage with people. Like, in some ways we connected over social media, right? So like that you build relationships, right? Really, really great relationships that end up with really
Only
great.
positive. Yeah.
Totally. It's about being intentional, man. So here's what I do. I take one day off a week from social media, right? I kind of schedule it. It's not like it's the same day every week, but it's like, you know what, man, it's gonna be a Tuesday this week. It's gonna be a Wednesday.
This is it.
The reason is it's not about what I have going on that week. It's just about that's the day it isn't. So like if I have all the time in the world and I go to grab my phone, I'm like, oh, sorry, man, it's your day off. Can't do it. So now I have to focus on something else. And it's like, all right, man, well, what am I gonna do? So I call it a tiny act of discipline, right? And it's like now I have to shift my attention to focus on something else, right? And it might be reading, it might be doing something else. So I'll be in a waiting room, let's say, and everybody's on their phone, and I'm just looking around and I'm looking at everybody else, and I'm like taking inventory, right? I look for those opportunities. So what happens is that's actively training my mind not to give into an urge or a stimulus and have to be disciplined, right? Right? You think about a wrestler, man, how important is that? But what also happens is the next day when I come back, man, I'm weirdly super interested and excited to get back on social. Like, I want to know what all my 4,000 friends are up to. I'm engaging with the content more. I appreciate the experience. And so part of it, man, I don't think is being all or none. It's sort of finding ways where you don't go on, right? Like with my athletes, I tell them, man, like when we had Olympic trials, right? I told Nashawn Garrett and Mike Machiavello, guys, think about deleting your app for this weekend. Everybody you need is here. Like, you don't, right? Like, and they were like, man, that's an amazing idea. And I'm like, just be intentional, man. Be here, be present, get off of it, right?
Yeah.
A lot of my pro athletes, right? When you go into like a weekend, right?
Good.
you're going to be off. And so now you can be present, you can be intentional, makes a big difference. And it allows you to refresh your mind. I also have certain parts of the day where I try, like when I come home and I'm with my kid before he goes to bed, man, I try really, really, really hard not to go on my phone. Right. Because during that, that's only that I'm not going to get that time back. So I think it's like, man, finding times to be intentional where you're more present. And that way, when you are on your phone, it's not something that's completely just drain your mental battery like it is your physical battery.
Yeah.
I like
This is gonna sound like real quick, Ryan. This is gonna
David.
sound like a paid promotion, but I just recently got this. I got this app called Opal. It's not a paid promotion, by the way. Opal, if you want to give us money, it can be.
Not yet.
But um, it's an app. You set blocks you can set for whatever app it is. I just do it for all social media apps, and you have it like where just certain times of day. And the only way to get that block off would be to delete the app, and you got to pay $90 for the year. So you're like shooting yourself in the foot if you're deleting that app. So now I block social media like I can. It's like whenever I get up 5:30 till like 9 a.m. and I block it from like 10 till 2. If I want to get work done, and I block it from like 7 till I go to bed. So there's like just windows. And then what I've found myself is like, I only engage really with the stuff I like to engage with, respond to messages, that sort of thing. I'll look at the people that are important to me. And then I'm like, and now over the last like 2 weeks that I've had it, like you said, I've been more engaged with the stuff I want to be engaged with, but less like just reaching for my phone to pass time. So I think it's a similar strategy. It's that you call it tiny acts of self-discipline. Have you read Dopamine Nation? I like that book a lot. She's a Stanford neurobiologist, I think, but she calls it self-binding, which is like something to, practice restraint.
Yeah, I think that's interesting too, and it's funny. You brought up the like logging out of social media too. Like I definitely started doing that when I was competing, because it'd be like you'd get done with a match, and it was like as much as you didn't want to go on it, like you'd be tagged in like this and this happened, or this and this, or somebody mentions you in this comment, and I was like, it got to a point where I'm like, hey, I'm a competitor, I'm not a fan, like that's not for me, and so I'd like just log out of my social media for a couple, months, or maybe log in once every 2 or 3 weeks or something. But it was interesting because it's like I don't really feel like it like affected me that much, but I was like, I'm not gonna let this like get me more anxious or less anxious based on some random person on the internet that you don't know says something. Um, but I also think that it was, I don't know. I think there's some people that are motivated by that stuff. Like I had teammates that like they loved it when people were talking smack to them in comment sections and stuff, and it like helped them perform better. And so I think there's definitely some individual variance and different like mindsets behind that stuff. But especially with like the NIL world, it is interesting. I think athletes got to deal with this stuff a lot more, and it's advantageous maybe for your brand to lean into some of these things, where it's like not as advantageous to like your performance to have all this extra like noise outside of you. Um, so yeah, I think that's super interesting. You take a day off. I like that. And I think I've also tried to more so like set boundaries with a phone where it's like, hey, when I come home, it's like, all right, it's going on the counter and maybe I'll check it once before bed. But it's like now this time's intentional when you get home, and it's like you're gonna eat dinner with your spouse and hang out and like get done maybe some extra work, and try not to like, hey, let me just let this work day flow and everything, because like it's very easy now to get like, okay, I got this email quick. I got to respond to this quick. Okay, I got to do this quick. And it's like you're working 24/7 and you never get that mental break. Um, and I think I don't know if that's added to this or not, but I feel like that's overwhelming for a lot of people. It's like you can work on your commute on the train from your phone. You can respond to this email during your lunch break. You can continue to just like constantly have these stimulant like going into your head from just like all these different areas. So that's interesting. I like the one day a week off.
Well, you also asked me earlier, like, does mental health gotten worse? I mean, I think that's part of it, man. It's like our brains aren't getting breaks now. Like they're just overwhelmed, overstimulated, overexhausted, and then it's just thinking about it. But like when you think about our sport, like our sport that we did, the reason we're successful, man, it's a lot of discipline. Like you have to really decide and make that choice intentionally. I mean, am I going to give into this urge or am I not? Am I going to eat this right now or am I going to not? Am I going to get this extra work in or am I going to like work out another 5-10 minutes and see if I can get down or not? And so you learn those things, but when you get out of the sport, it's hard to find things to be that competitive at. So in some ways, think about this, particularly from an athletic standpoint, man, what can I compete at is and continue to get better at? It's like my relationship with social media. And I could just give into the urge or I can set the limits and the boundaries and know, I mean, here's the other thing. The reason I also
Love
do
that.
this is I know that very few people can actually do that. I know very few people can take a day off. They won't do it. They don't even want to go there. It's not even something they desire to challenge themselves with. But to me, the older I get, man, the more I'm looking for ways to challenge my mind and my body and set my others, well, my age and younger than me. So like these are ways that I know that I'm going to continue to be better at what I do because I know I'm doing hard, challenging things that other people will not do. They just won't go there. And so for that, like to me, that's a mindset thing, but it's also me becoming a better doctor, a better parent, a better person, right?
Yeah, you're a competitor and you're looking for ways to compete.
And I'm
Yeah, I
competing.
love that. Turn anything into a competition. Yeah, but I'm in.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. I think that's a great way, great way to wrap it up. I think one last thing, Dr. T, really appreciate everything. This has been awesome. Your wealth of knowledge.
Love it.
Definitely could have many conversations with you and want to continue to learn from you and grow from you. Where can people find your stuff? Can you give us a kind of quick shout out on your stuff that you got going on?
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. So first of all, I'm on Instagram at Dr. T _ sports psych, SPORTS PSYCH. Dr. T _
Right.
like,
It's
so
a tough one.
if that's, my mindset stuff, my workout stuff like that. I have a podcast that you've been on, which will release soon called The Mindset Experience, which is available on all major platforms. And then I have a TED talk called Control the Controllables. So if you go to YouTube's TEDx or just type in TEDx, Control the Controllables, then you can see that. And that's also a really, what I think and hope is a really impactful piece that'll help a lot of people. So those are probably the biggest three things. If you search Mindset Training Institute, you'll find me as well. So
Awesome. We'll link your TEDx
Thank
too in
you.
this podcast. So thank you. Really appreciate it.
man, you guys are awesome. This was a lot of fun, man. I really do appreciate it.
It was fun.